Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning. Look at this. Hello, Aaron.
Hey, how are you doing?
Let's see if you come to the light.
Oh.
Yes. All right. Welcome everybody to another show of Mini Geology Show, where Mini Geology puts in connection geology with society. So today we are here in Houston, and we are at the Houston Climate Justice Museum. And we're here with a co-founder. His name is Aaron Ambroso. So Aaron, you are the co-founder of the Houston Climate Justice Museum. We are sitting in here in the museum, and we're gonna show this area in here with Tiffany over there that is waving. And you see Be Someone, the typical graffiti of Houston. Okay, so Aaron, we're gonna be talking for roughly a little bit less than an hour. And I would like to start with the conception of this museum. How did you come up with this idea? And then we'll talk about realization about it.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for coming by and having us on the show. We're excited to talk to you. You talked about geology. Your show as being kind of geology plus culture, and I think that we're kind of like culture plus geology, going from the other direction. So my background is in working in museums, and my background is also in art history. I actually grew up in North Carolina. I worked at a couple of museums in North Carolina, including the North Carolina Museum of Art, and then I moved here to work at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. I think once I've also had a long time interest in environmental issues. When I moved here, I got involved with a couple of local organizations, Sunrise Houston, Extinction Rebellion. These are and the kind of wider activist scene around environmental justice. And working in museums alongside of that, what strikes you is, on the one hand, kind of a lack of critical discussion in major museums around issues of climate change and environmental justice. And also you find that museums deal a lot with nature, landscape paintings, for example. But the discussions around those paintings can often feel kind of like you're leaving out a lot of different voices that should be involved. And so I guess part of the conception of this museum was to have a space where we could talk about nature really critically, talk about nature cross-culturally, but also have a space to talk about climate change more generally within Houston. As you know, the significance of the city is also what I think prompted the creation of the museum as well.
So you think that there was something missing?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, missing discourse around climate change and environmental justice within current museums. Partly that comes through funding structures of those museums. The boards of major museums here are largely comprised of oil and gas industry. And of course, the fourth floor of the Houston Museum of Natural History is perhaps where that is seen most clearly. So the narrative there, of course, being kind of a celebratory history of the oil industry without really taking into account some of the darker sides of what that lifestyle has kind of caused And so we wanted to create narratives that were a little bit different than that. We wanted to try to also foreground and think a lot about the lives and voices of frontline communities. Those communities, largely communities of color, who bear the brunt of pollution and kind of the darker side of extraction. And so, which is a type of voice that I think is particularly missing from those larger narratives that are, let's say, on the fourth floor of the HMNS.
How do you move from the conception, the idea of a need, and the realization, the birth of this place in here?
That's a great question. I think on the one hand, you can try to make change within an institutional structure. I think that what I found is that institutions move slowly, and there's lots of levels of approval, and they're often very hierarchical. And so starting a space was a way to just experiment, honestly. To have a space where things can come and go very quickly, where we can just throw ideas out and not have to worry about having to go through lots of lengthy processes of approval or something like that. But I think we looked around the city for different places to have this space, and we found our current space just kind of on a whim. It just seemed to fit in terms of size and what we were looking for, and so we decided to give it a go. I think that I also have to mention Tiffany, our co-founder, because Tiffany is incredibly skilled at so many things, including construction and the kinds of other things that are necessary to start a space like this. We really built this from the ground up. We built a lot of walls, and then we also created a lot of the exhibits and installations in here. And so I think her input, and then also so many people that we've talked to and that have been really, really generous over the past 8 months or 9 months or so with their time and with their advice, also were really crucial, integral into.
What was the most difficult thing realizing the space that you have in here?
There's a lot of challenging things that are here. Talking about climate change and the kind of worldwide catastrophe that is climate change can be really disheartening, and it can also shut you down. It can make you feel like there's no hope, or we shouldn't, there's nothing that we can do. And so I think a lot of what we do here is obviously critiquing the systems that have gotten us here and that continue to propel us in a very unsustainable direction. But we also really try to create new narratives, to create wonder, to create inspiration. I think the ultimate goal of our museum is to inspire people to action.
What about the material difficulties that you had to organize a space like this one?
Well, I think funding for arts in general is really tough to come by, especially right now. But in general, I think also the arts are in general underfunded. But for example, the Houston Arts Alliance is based on the hotel occupancy tax, and that took a huge hit during COVID. And so the Houston Arts Alliance grants also then took a huge hit, and that's really hard for artists. I think the other thing is that materially, our name is the Houston Climate Justice Museum instead of, let's say, the Houston Climate Museum. And so I think that the word justice being in our name is really important, but it also makes us perhaps less appealing for funding. Most traditional museums, you're going to get funding from grants, and you're also going to get funding from donations, and that's your two main sources of funding. To do so requires generally that you're a 501c3, that you become a nonprofit with the IRS. That's a pretty major step. We're relatively new, and so we're kind of on the cusp of making that leap. We're exploring what it means to be fiscally sponsored, which is where you kind of enter into a contract with another nonprofit while you yourself are not, and so but that's a way for you to get things like tax deductible donations and certain types of grants without becoming a full-on 501c3. But we're also exploring just becoming a 501c3, as it opens up a lot of local funding, local endowments, local charities that are designed for nonprofits specifically is a great way to make this kind of work sustainable. But it definitely requires a lot of upfront work, and filing for 501c3 status is no small thing.
Who could be the private sponsors that they can help?
Yeah. That's a great question too, and something that we've thought a little bit about. I think any kind of, any kind of donation, any kind of support is absolutely necessary and welcome. But I think there's a lot of ethical questions around money from large, obviously from oil and gas companies and large corporations like that kind of rub up against what we are ethically about. So
that means that you wouldn't accept money from oil and gas companies?
Well, I'll be completely honest, we haven't had any offers. So I don't know that we would or wouldn't For sure, 100%.
Aaron, we are going to move into the content of what is in this museum titled Houston Climate Justice Museum.
Yeah.
What do you mean by justice?
Yeah. You know, climate justice kind of comes out of the idea of environmental justice, and what I think myself and Tiffany understand it to mean is, just broadly speaking, an ethical look at the environmental situation or the climate situation. So justice means thinking about the inequalities of environment and the inequalities of climate change. Climate change will not impact everyone the same. And we also need to think about, it also directs our attention towards the responsibilities of who has created those unjust situations and who has been responsible, for climate change. So justice also means a just transition from our current fossil fuel-based economy to a more sustainable, renewable, just economy. And that means partly a just transition for those workers. So it means not just leaving people high and dry and without work. It also means wrapping in social justice causes with environmental issues. And that speaks to, of course, the interconnection of all these things, the interconnection of labor exploitation and climate change.
What is the role of this museum that we are in right now? Are you advocating for justice, or are you denouncing injustices, or you're trying to be neutral?
Well, we're certainly not trying to be neutral. I think that's actually kind of getting to the crux of the issue and what we're trying to do here. We're a museum for a reason, and that's because that museums are often considered neutral spaces. There's different forms of neutrality. Scientific objectivity is one. There's also aesthetic freedom or aesthetic autonomy from social conditions. That's another form of neutrality. Or the museum trying to be a neutral institution when it imagines that it's just displaying art and not influencing the way that people behave or something along those lines. There's lots of different forms of neutrality, but I think that as a museum, we're really trying not to be neutral, and we're trying to actually show that when we think we're in a neutral situation, it's precisely when we think we're doing something that's not political, when politics is involved. I mentioned landscape painting earlier. I think landscape painting is a great example where on the one hand, landscape painting can be celebrated as these great sublime images of celebration of the sublimity of nature, the kinds of primal beauty of nature, when at the same time the creation of those landscape paintings was by and for an urban audience during a time which railroads were being constructed, and a lot of Eastern businessmen were keen to finance those railroads through travel, through vacation for Eastern city-dwelling people. And it was also a time when that went hand in hand with the expulsion of Native Americans from those landscapes. So if you see a lot of those 19th century landscape paintings, American landscape paintings, like the one behind me here, you'll see an absence of Native American culture, or you'll see Native Americans painted in a kind of childlike, as children or as backwards, as savages. And so I think that trying to show the politics within these paintings, within where we think we're just experiencing nature, just something which is universally understood, we actually seeing something much more complicated, a historical version of nature. So when you're asking what is our goal, what are we trying to do? We're trying to show how attitudes towards nature, attitudes towards science, and attitudes towards art can often reproduce the very same things that have gotten us into environmental problematics in the first place, or colonial relationships with others in the first place. So I think trying to show how we reproduce those things within that space that we think is supposed to be neutral is really what that's our niche. Now, of course, we advocate for justice and we try to critique injustice, but I think really what we try to do is practice museums a little bit differently, because there's so much that can be done within that field.
Do you have any specific author or philosopher or person that inspires you when you think about justice in this context?
Sure. I mean, I think of a group of artists who often are under the banner institutional critique. Those artists are like Andrea Fraser, Fred Wilson, Marielle Ukelius. These are all artists who have worked really closely with museums in order to talk about issues of race, sexism, power dynamics within museums. Also, I want to mention Mark Dion as a really important artist that those are kind of some of our conceptual tools in terms of artists. In terms of authors, again, so many. I think of James Clifford. James Clifford is an anthropologist that's written a lot wrote a lot in the 90s and through the 2000s about Native American museums, especially on the Northwest Coast, and some really fantastic analysis and critique that, even though it was from 20 years ago, I think still resonates so much. And I think it's also hard to avoid Donna Haraway in these discussions. She's a feminist philosopher of science and historian who's written about museums in different capacities, and I think that her work is really a part of where we think from.
Aaron, what are you gonna show in the museum? Are you gonna show art? Are you gonna show objects related to science? What are the material things, if any, you're gonna bring in here?
A lot of what we're interested in is in the idea of something. So we're displaying a landscape painting here and a photograph as well. We're not so much we don't have the original landscape painting, we're just showing a reproduction of it. But it's still in a frame, printed on canvas. It has a sense of reality to it. In other words, you can feel like you're standing in front of the real thing, even though you're not. So we're not trying to replicate, let's say, what museums do with their collections of very, very valuable of artworks. We're interested more in, we want you to have the experience of feeling like you're in front of the real thing, but we also want it to be more focused on what is the idea behind it. How can we think more about what is the idea about collection and preservation and representation that these objects are evincing? That's what we're more interested in. So we're not going to be displaying, let's say, historical works of art. That being said, we also have a section of the museum that's dedicated to collecting objects from the community. It's called a living library, and it is a place where we've invited mostly community activists in the ecological sphere, to bring objects to the museum that relate to environmental justice or climate change. And these objects are everything from pipes that burst in the February winter storm to a purse that survived Hurricane Harvey, to a banner that's used by the Houston Democratic Socialists of America in their protests. And these are objects that are designed not to be permanent members of a collection here. They're designed for to be temporarily displayed, and then they can go back to other places or travel elsewhere. We really want to think about objects as travelers. You know, sometimes museum collections feel so permanent. They feel museums are kind of designed to, with conservation, to preserve something indefinitely in the state that it's in. And we want to think about objects as not a final resting place within a museum, but that can travel elsewhere, that can have another life, that can have another meaning. Part of that is through the amazing processes of repatriation that we've seen in the last, let's say, 40, even 50 years between Native American objects and their museums. And the repatriation of those objects back to Native communities where they can live another life and have another meaning. I think what we're trying to do is really influenced on that. So the idea that an object can come but then leave and have another life and have another meaning somewhere else. But the museum's not a final resting spot. We also create a lot of things ourselves here. We created a diorama here. We also created a kind of like a large chart a genealogical chart showing connections between industry, monopoly capitalism, and the founding of museums in the United States. And so some of what we do here is we build things ourselves. I also want to mention one last thing is that we have a great relationship with Sam Houston State University Collection. There's a really generous man named Will Godwin who we're just really indebted to, and he's been very generous in lending us some objects. So we are working with that museum to get some various different objects here. I think we need to change what curating looks like. I think one of the things that can be frustrating at a museum level is that communities are often brought in after exhibits are already decided. In other words, exhibits will have already the decisions about what objects will be in the exhibit, how they'll be laid out, collections, the descriptions. These will all be decided, and then communities are brought in to decide programming, how the exhibit could connect to different elements of the community. And so it's much more difficult to bring community members in at the very beginning, to really decide from the beginning what will matter. That's something that we struggle with too. I mean, that's a very hard work to do. And that is, I think that's an ideal, that's a goal that's being practiced differently at different museums. It's something that we aspire towards, and absolutely, we're implicated in all of this. So I don't mean to, to kind of not implicate us. I do think that we absolutely are involved in those same things. Right now, we're working on an exhibit, our next project, which is focusing on migration, specifically climate migration, the pressures that force people to migrate globally due to climate, and also on the southern border of the United States. And with that, we have some objects that were collected on the southern border. So we're really trying to work closely with people involved in the undocumented migrant community here in Houston and broader. And those, again, that's a very challenging thing to do. And so I think that's relearning how to work in a museum.
Can you tell us an example, like a very practical, real example of some object and attached concept that you have in here related to the climate justice? So something that you have in here, that you thought about it to bring it in here, the concept that is behind it, and what you want to communicate through it about climate justice.
That's a great question. There's so many options, but I think one is sugar. We have a display that has a few different commodities over there: sugar, rubber, and poppy seeds. Poppy seeds. And these are all ways that you can think about our contemporary ecological kind of situation is through the histories of commodities. And actually, sugar is a great one. Sugar is, speaks to, let's say, the histories of slavery, the histories of plantation cropping, so monocropping, and the kinds of issues and worlds that monocropping creates. And it also speaks to a more local context. So in Sugarland, which is just south of Houston, there is actually discovered just recently the unmarked graves of, I think, close to 70 to 100 African American laborers who worked on the sugar plantations in Sugarland in very, very harsh conditions through a system that was basically post-slavery, in which people who were in the who were incarcerated, who were in the prison system, could basically have their labor sold as slaves through legal means. And so I think it speaks to kind of a local history of brutality. It also speaks to the climate, in the sense that part of the ecological problem that we're in is the consequences of industrial production, and that it means monocropping. The kinds of monocropping that really simplifies ecological life, but then in doing so creates sort of these unknown problems. And it also creates this process of, for example, more and more pesticide spraying. Or you spray the pesticides and then a bug develops a resistance, so you create a new pesticide for a new resistance, and then there's a multiplying of consequences. And those kinds of consequences, over and above, let's say, a warming climate, are also really significant, and we can't forget about that kind of thing. So I would say that's one object. I can highlight another one.
Yeah.
There's I wanted to highlight a poster that was brought here through a climate march that youth activists through Sunrise, which is a national organization. There was a group, maybe 10 to 15 youth climate activists through Sunrise that marched from New Orleans to Houston to advocate for the creation of a climate corps. And this was back in June. And they finally got to Houston after 400 some miles. And we had an event here at the museum, partially organized by them, and where youth marchers, along with some folks from the local community, spoke about the history of environmental justice, why they were marching, and one of the posters that they had from the march they left here. It's, I think, meaningful in so many ways. It's a kind of a document of the power of the youth climate movement, which I mean is just incredible. Everywhere you look, they're doing such great work. So they're a group that we try to take inspiration from and try to use this as a platform to amplify what they do.
So, Aaron, I would like now to go to one of the main questions that you pose yourself through the museum. That is, how will you or will society tackle the climate crisis? What do you propose through the museum?
I think that's really where you'll find us maybe at our thinnest of answers, because I don't know that we've frankly put enough thought into that kind of thing. But I think that, like I mentioned at the beginning, these partnerships create partnerships between scientists, historians, and artists in order to create and inspire people. That's really important. I think that those projects generally are things that we need. I think also we really need to try to work with the grassroots organizations that are pushing for climate justice here at the local level. I'm kind of skirting your question, which was, what do we need to do? I mean, I guess, yeah, my answer is I don't quite know.
Is it something, do you feel responsible to give an answer to that important question? Or would you see yourself as a medium to allow others to answer that question?
Yeah, I think that we'd like to be a medium, a microphone for other people to answer that question. Absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, certainly we support things like the Green New Deal, and the creation of living wage jobs, dignified jobs that can also help solve the climate crisis. I think we would like to be a place where people can use their voice to present answers and to amplify what their work is.
What is your relationship, or what would you like to be the relationship between the museum and industry?
I think that it's really important to create alliances and create and organize. That's what we really need. We need to create alliances. We need to organize in order to try to address this elephant in the room. There's plenty of people who work in industry within Houston, who work in the oil and gas industry, but who also care about the future. They care about the environment, and so I think that we really need to try to create alliances between them and activists and artists. I mean, those are, to me, seem to be really important alliances to create. Part of that is through trying to find shared languages. When you're trying to communicate between different groups, everyone has different ways of describing things, different ways of thinking about things.
So I understand that you still don't have strong ties with industry. There's no a dialogue with industry yet. What would be, in your mind, the ideal relationship with industry in the contingency of Houston?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard question to answer. You know, we've been working on this project called Plans and Fragments, which is a project that would involve discussions between industry and activists over the Houston Climate Action Plan, trying to think critically about how we can either create a new climate action plan or what are some of the blindnesses of climate action plans. So I think that that's getting, I think at a basic level, getting industry involved here in conversations is something we need to do. We've also worked we've went and visited the Houston Geophysical Society, which has a small museum and collection in West Houston, I think that's right, and is run by some kind of generally retired geologists. And we went and had some interesting discussions with them. They have a lot of fantastic artifacts of the oil industry over there, of geology. So I think trying to think about how could we bring some of those objects here and have a dialogue. It also has to be, you know, like I said, it has to be a dialogue that's not putting people down. That's kind of productive. That's not going to alienate people. But at the same time, we have to keep tension. You know, we have to make sure that we stay with the trouble. We have to make sure that we, that we're not just kind of painting a rosy picture or something like that. So I think that's a place that a collaboration can happen. Yeah.
What is the relationship with the neighborhood?
Yeah, we're in the East End. East End is a heavily gentrifying neighborhood where expensive condos are coming in and housing prices are going up. So it's also a neighborhood where of significant Spanish-speaking population, and I'd say that this is like engagement with our direct neighborhood is something that we're really trying to do. That's a goal of ours.
I would like to know if there are other museums like this one in the world,
Yeah.
and what is the one that inspires you the most?
Ooh. Yes, there's a climate change museum. I think it's called the Climate Museum. It's based in New York City. I know that they're kind of have different locations in New York City. I don't know if they have a permanent spot yet, but they've done exhibits in different parts of the city that are really fantastic and about climate change. There's also a really great initiative called the Museum of Capitalism that's kind of similar to what we've been doing in trying to think about what is an artifact of this really giant process, you know, called capitalism, and they've kind of have an open call to people to submit objects, and then their exhibits have also traveled the United States. Those are two museum institutions that come to mind. I know there's also another museum of, I can't remember the name of it, Petroleum Museum of Oil that's in Norway. That's we've heard a lot about. That's supposed to be focusing on the history of the oil industry and is a powerful museum. In terms of, I also want to highlight there are museums within Houston, or there's arts organizations within Houston that are focusing on these subjects. For example, Project Row Houses. Currently, I'm not sure if it's still going on, but just had an exhibit called Gulf Coast Anthropocene, where artists of color reflected on ecological, social issues within the Gulf Coast. And so I know that there is stuff going on at the local level that we also look up to. I think in terms of what inspires us, definitely Project Row Houses is a really big inspiration for us. The way that they work in arts with also social programming. There's so much going on there in terms of the way that they work with the community to give homes to single mothers and training for the arts community, and so many things that they provide there.
What is the best way to kick off this museum? Is like concentrating and focusing on what is here around you in the city, in the state of Texas, or are you projected internationally and looking at the entire international arena?
I think local is where we're focused on. I think trying to think through the local first and foremost, and there's always global connections in the local. You know, you can't, everywhere you look, there's global connections in this table, in the shirt that you're wearing, right? So, no, we're not trying to project on some international global thing. We'd rather focus on the local and get to the global through the local because it's always there, and it's that's our contemporary world. So
I would like to know from you, who founded this Museum of Climate Justice in Houston, what is the Anthropocene?
The Anthropocene, you know, is a term that was invented in the early 2000s by geologists, earth scientists, to name an epoch that was where humans have become the primary geological force. Since then, it's become this really rich term for all kinds of collaborations and thinking about human, social, nature conundrums and intertwinings. You know, one major aspect of the Anthropocene is that human history and natural history have become conflated. In other words, we can read human history through nature, and we can read natural history through humans now. We have a mixing up of all of these things in a really productive way that allows for so many kinds of narratives and stories. On the other hand, the Anthropocene as a concept can has the drawback of making ecological destruction seem to be the effect of the human species, which is not. It's an effect of various particular forms of life, particular forms of organization. You know, obviously, I'm thinking about capitalism. Capitalism has been is an indelible force that is part of the climate crisis. I'm thinking about, as we mentioned earlier, the plantation life, monocropping, as a really important part of our modern world. So people have come up with other names for an epoch called the Capitalocene or the Plantationocene to help us think, generatively about that this time of ecological destruction is not a human species act. So I think here we use the Anthropocene as a concept. Obviously, it's in the title of our show, but we really want to try to have a big question mark after it, a really big question mark to say, do we really live in this time called the Anthropocene? Because there's so many other ways to think about it. And so while we recognize its usefulness, we also want to kind of try to complicate it. Another project I'm thinking about recently is called Feral Atlas. Feral Atlas argument is that the Anthropocene, is that the unintended consequences, or the consequences of industrial life, the non-human consequences of industrial life, that is the Anthropocene. So invasive species, frogs that get onto container ships that then are traveled from one continent to the other and then are inserted into local ecosystems. Mosquitoes that jump onto slave ships in the 16th century and then go from Africa to the Caribbean and then start reproducing. That's the Anthropocene. Toxic waste and runoff, or for example, a great example is in Chernobyl. The radioactivity that's left over from Chernobyl has made its way into blueberries that are grown near Chernobyl and that are then sold around the world and eaten. And so radiation from Chernobyl is spread. And that is all of these consequences, unintended and intended effects that go along with industrial life. I mean, Feral Atlas, which is a fantastic digital project, argues that this is the Anthropocene. All of these consequences and imbrications and intertwinings. And I think that's a really, really productive place to be.
Aaron, what is next?
We want to try to work with some of the community partners that we have. Planet Forward, which is an amazing network of urban farms that works with refugees farmers to set them up with urban farms in Houston, is an organization that we have close relationships with, that we've been working on brainstorming what projects could look like I already mentioned West Street Recovery. Another one is Air Alliance Houston. These are all fantastic local organizations that are doing great work around environmental justice that we want to try to partner with in some substantial way. The other thing that we want to do is work with students. There's different ways to do that. I think we've thought about what would it look like to have the Climate Justice Museum go to a school and do a presentation or a project within Houston. I think that's a really interesting thing we're thinking about. We're also thinking about artists who could come to the museum for workshops. So something we would like to do is have artist workshops here at the museum to train or help offer opportunities for young budding artists. Those are some of the kind of things on the horizon. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, fiscally thinking about a number of things as a way forward for the museum to become financially sustainable, which is a huge goal of ours.
So Aaron, would you like to show me the map that you have and explain it to the audience where you show the connections between museums and industry?
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Where do we start from?
Well, I think starting right here is a good place to start. We have a few different things right here that are really important. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Carl Ackley, Central Park. These are kind of bringing together the nexus of players that would form early American natural history museums, like the American Museum of Natural History, through taxidermy, through colonial trips to Africa. We have to understand the close connection between big game hunting that was done by wealthy white Americans and the mounting of specimens in natural history museums, especially specimens from Africa, like a gorilla, for example. And then I think
where do we move from there?
Yeah.
How do we follow the lines?
We can kind of follow them down and down this way. We have to, for example, the Immigration Act of 1924, or the U.S. Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. These highlight some of the cultural context that accompanied early American museums, like the American Museum of Natural History. For example, eugenics. The museum was involved in promoting the science, what was then considered the science or the pseudoscience of eugenics. And we also have to realize that these were institutions that were created created at a time of great labor strife, of the women's movement, and of Jim Crow. And that these museums, were not progressive institutions, but in fact, often naturalized social hierarchies in their displays. Going down, we can see here the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was really important in the founding of the American Museum of Natural History. And just below it, you can see the removal of that statue recently in June 2020. That statue showed Roosevelt on a horse with two figures, one representing Africa and one representing an American Indian, kind of at his sides below him in a sort of childlike manner. Obviously, the statue had very racial connotations that went back to that origin, those patriarchal colonialist origins of the museum. And with its removal, obviously speaks to some of the pressures that museums are now facing around representation and responsibility. And I think it opens up a space for museums or for communities rather, to reimagine, public monuments. This gives us, now there's a space for a new monument that could foreground some of the cultures and knowledges that were actively repressed through the exhibits, both the biology and the cultural exhibits of the American Museum of Natural History throughout much of the 20th century.
Look at all of these oil companies. Tell us about those. What's the relationship with museums?
So I think the relationship is between the Rockefeller family and those oil companies. John D. Rockefeller, who started Standard Oil in 1870, which was then broken up into what is known as the Six Sisters. These 6 different oil companies that then went on to become Mobil or Exxon. Those companies then in turn funded, one thing that's not shown here is the funding that those companies gave, the corporate funding that those companies gave to, for example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and other exhibits around the country. I think this kind of also goes back to the Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller's Museum of Primitive Art, which opened in 1954 and closed in 1974, and which is now the Rockefeller wing of Art of Africa in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This has been a really important focal point. On the one hand, those kinds of objects are collected through a process of colonialism. I mean, literally the process of African colonialism that the European nations and the United States participated in was part of the process for getting those objects back in various means, some through trading, but often through stealing, back to European and American museums. So the collections, in a very material way, come through colonialism. But then there's also questions of just representation as well. Questions of repatriation and representation, which are going on now. There's also, divestment, thinking about where money comes from. So you can see here, this is the Metropolitan no longer accepting gifts from the Sackler family. And you can also see over to the left there, the Serpentine Gallery of London no longer using the Sackler name in their moniker. So
why? What's wrong with the Sackler family?
So the Sackler family is the family that it's the opioid who have played a major role in the opioid manufacture and opioid endemic, I guess you'd say, or crisis within the United States. So those are a few of the, I guess, important things that this diagram tries to show. On the one hand, it also speaks to, it's kind of like a genealogical chart. So while like a lot of normal genealogies, certain things are forgotten and left out. Certain things are harder to recover because they had less documentation, for various different reasons. So I think another thing that's important to notice about this is that we can trace some of these genealogies because certain things are better recorded. Certain places of privilege are more readily submitted to posterity or make it to the genealogical chart, whereas other times charts trail off for various different reasons. It also speaks to paternal relationships, the idea of something fathering something else, which is of course a particular type of relationship. And I think that in some cases this chart is a simplification of really what is in reality very messy relationships.
So Aaron, I'm gonna leave you now the mic open if you wanna take us to any other place in the museum, or if you wanna express any other concepts that you haven't expressed. Yeah. And so this is we're reaching the top of the hour with this show of Mini Geology. So I'm gonna give you again the chance to complete your thoughts if you haven't, or show any extra thing, any extra object that you have to the audience.
I kind of want to ask our co-creator, who doesn't want to be on camera. No, she doesn't want to talk. Okay. Maybe we can talk about just this image over here.
Yeah.
Really quickly. Thank you so much.
All right. So with this, we can stay here together and say goodbye to another episode of Mini Geology. Here with Aaron.
Yes.
What's your last name?
Ambroso.
Here with Aaron Ambroso and Tiffany over there, co-founder, that she doesn't really want to have, but we're gonna finish Mini Geology showing Tiffany. Wave, Tiffany. Bye, Tiffany.